thank you to SteelOrbis and IREPAS for this extraordinary conference. I am quite clearly not Matt Nolan, and I appreciate all of your help, and I am very happy to be here. He does send his deep regrets, and hello to all of you. Um, I'll be starting with we're talking about US trade policy and steel. Has anything really changed post-Trump? Um, I'll be talking about some broader overview issues, and then my colleague will discuss more like trade remedy specific topics that we're seeing come up more recently. And so, Trump versus Biden trade policy, which is which, pro worker, pro union. You're going to hear me say that quite a bit because they're both pretty much the same. So, under the Trump administration, the America First trade policy, looking for companies to compete and set up manufacturing in the United States, supporting workers, supporting the communities that workers live in, and to hire young people, give them hope and a real shot at prosperity again. And then under the Biden administration, we see Ambassador Catherine Tai saying that the USTR's worker centered trade agenda is realizing President Biden's vision to grow the American economy from the bottom up and the middle out. We're seeing this trend toward looking inward continuing, and we're looking away from free trade. We're, we're looking away from free trade. And so, some key components of the Biden trade agenda, whether it's a softer form of economic nationalism, again, a worker and union centric policy, looking at robust industrial policies with subsidies to promote key sectors such as semiconductors and electric vehicles. There's been an effort to promote democracy, strengthen the US institutions, address corruption, and to promote even growth within the US. The US broad interpretation of what is national security. It's been seen recently as broadly as just to protect the US industry, not necessarily working on market access with trade agreements, but more towards trade partnerships, which is something that we have not necessarily seen historically. And then very increased enforcement of US rights under the existing trade agreements, including under the US, Mexico, and Canada trade agreement. We're seeing quite a bit of actual enforcement of the forced labor laws in the United States. And China is a hot topic in the United States as it is, as we've just seen. And between 2018 and 2020, the US used Section 301 to impose duties ranging from 7.5% to 25% and over $500 billion in Chinese imports due to unfair practices. There's Biden administration has continued to apply these Section 301 duties with exclusions. There's almost constant discussions in Congress over additional worker centric policies, just releasing plans to draft packages expanding on the CHIPS legislation, which is for semiconductors. The full name is for helpful incentives for producing semiconductors. So right there in the name is incentives, which would limit the flow of advanced technologies to Chinese government, utilizing export laws, sanctions, and quote additional deterrence. Um, this would also limit the critical flow of this would curtail the flow of investment in key sectors from China, and then incentivize and secure domestic investment in biotech manufacturing and critical technologies. The Biden administration has announced that this is an effort to continue to coordinate with the US's economic allies and to maintain those strategic alliances and to counter China's Belt and Road policies. In October, the Commerce Department issued new rules aimed at cutting off the Chinese firm's abilities to manufacture advanced computer chips. Additional restrictions on Chinese investment in US technology companies and controls on exports to China have been abound. Um, an outbound investment review is likely. Most recently, we are also seeing a lot of congressional discussion on TikTok, executive orders to limit the ability of Chinese apps like TikTok to collect data from Americans. So then what about steel? The US continues to aggressively protect the US steel industry as part of as part of Biden's pro-worker and pro-union worker policy. The 232 duties remain in place with limited exclusions for short supply products and tariff rate quotas for products melted and poured in in the EU. The US and EU commitment to addressing climate change with the Global Steel Climate Council to incentivize green production was part of an extension of the 2021 agreements to to implement tariff quotas, reduce to end the retaliatory tariffs. This Green Steel Club is there's not a real connection between the EU and the US at this moment. The US sent a proposal to the EU in December of 2022. The EU countered that US proposal just in March. And where we are at is that under the Biden administration's plan, there would be a tariff wall for any party that would not participate in the agreement regarding emissions reductions. Um, the way those emissions reduction plans are currently written, it essentially excludes China as written, excludes China not by name but by efforts. And again, the Biden administration to impose this tariff wall in the US would likely use the national security reason. To the On the other side, the European Union already has in place its carbon border adjustment mechanism where it will gradually impose tariffs and believes that the US plan is likely contrary to its WTO obligations. I think, as many in this room also recognize, the US has been very vocal that it does not necessarily need to abide by its WTO obligations. Um, and then moving forward, the Russian sanctions do not just cover Russia. The With respect to Canada, there's been a prohibition of imports of certain steel products from Russia, requiring at least 50% preferential origin, meaning steel made from Russian scrap is subject to a 35% custom duty. The EU has a prohibition of import or purchase, directly or indirectly, iron and steel products when processed in a third country incorporating iron and steel products or originating in Russia. And then the USA, customs duties are increased up to 70% on certain steel products. Russia is treated as a non-market economy in US anti-dumping investigations. There's On these custom duties, what is important to note is that there is no content amount. If there is any amount of Russian steel in those products, it is considered to be from Russia. Um, then continuing in our section 232 comparison as a little case study of the Trump administration versus the Biden administration. Although the Trump administration implemented 25% duties on steel products with a 50% increased duty on products from Turkey for 9 months, the Biden administration has continued those 232 duties. As I noted before, although there has been a TRQ with the EU with 2015 in quota levels and annual exceptions, and that exclusions are more often granted, the Biden US Department of Justice has also defended successfully and vigorously defended the 232 actions in federal court in the United States. Those three top cases, the Trans-Pacific case, which the court said that 50% duties on Turkish products were fine. The Borasan case, where 232 duties were deductible from the US price in anti-dumping cases, which had a practical effect of allowing higher anti-dumping duties based on that calculation. And then the building products case, where steel derivative products such as nails, staples, and tacks are also covered under the 232 order. And so then to discuss that section on trade remedy side, that section 232 did not necessarily stop trade cases. Bulent, would you like to come up here? Here's quite a bit of stuff.
Thank you, Jessica. And before I begin, I'd like to also thank SteelOrbis and the IREPAS organization for allowing us to speak. It's always a great pleasure. I've been to a few events, SteelOrbis, IREPAS events, but I see that they managed to raise the bar even further. So thanks again. So taking from where Jessica left, as she explained, Biden administration kept the Section 232 measures, but maybe unexpectedly, these high measures, which, as you know, are 25% for steel and 10% for aluminum, did not stop other trade cases such as dumping and subsidy. You see a big spike after the imposition of Section 232 measures. And to give you some examples, some very large cases has been initiated even though these high tariffs were in place. Just to name a few, PC Strand from 13 countries on the steel side. And in 2021, OCTG, covering a very substantial trade volume, imports from Mexico, Russia, Argentina, South Korea. And most recently, there's been a nail case. And 2 months ago, a case against tin mill products were initiated, targeting 8 countries. And on the aluminum side, while it's not the focus of this group, the largest ever dumping case in terms of number of countries targeted, which is common alloy aluminum sheet, were brought after these Section 232 measures were imposed, targeting 18 countries, which is the largest case in terms of country coverage in the history of United States dumping cases. So as Jessica also mentioned, as of 2022, US agreed on a tariff rate quota with EU. We just wanted to quickly take a look on some key products to show you where the quota level utilization is. I mean, we should remind you that these are administered quarterly, so 2022 is an average, but you can see that a large portion of the quotas are being currently used, especially in 2023. The major oil exporters of rebar, Portugal and Spain, they almost fully use their quotas. And again, it's OCTG, it's a tubular product, but it's a large volume product. As you can see, in 2023, major exporting countries fully used 100% of their quotas. So just to quickly go through these, I realize we're the last before the lunch break, so I'm gonna try to be quick. So as you can see, a large portion of the quotas are currently being used by EU countries on key steel products. Just to quickly revisit the current levels of dumping and subsidy duties on key steel products, starting with long products, of course. Unfortunately, many of the people in the room are very familiar with these trade cases. Currently, there are dumping and subsidy measures against 11 countries for rebar, and even a higher number of countries for wire rod. 16 countries are covered by in the wire rod dumping and subsidy countervailing duty orders. We put the levels of duties here. As you can see, some of these are quite high. And I should also remind you that these cases have been initiated over a long period of time, not all at once. Some other steel products, again, as you can see, steel plate. Pretty much anybody who can make steel plate is covered in a dumping and subsidy order in the US, 15 countries. On other flat products, corrosion resistant, there are duties against 5 products. HRC, there are duties against 14 products, and cold rolled, 6 countries are targeted. And these are all in addition to the Section 232 measures covering most of these countries. although you are familiar with trade remedies, you wanted trade remedies in general, dumping and subsidy, we wanted to talk a little bit about a new form of trade protection measure, which is being more and more frequently used by the US industry, which is the anti-circumvention. Anti-circumvention is basically an investigation that is used to expand the scope of the existing anti-dumping and subsidy orders to cover additional products or countries. The forms of circumvention that the US government is investigating is merchandise completed or assembled in the US or a third country, minor alterations to the merchandise, or a later developed merchandise. To give you some examples, most recently, there's been a circumvention case against a standard pipe coming from UAE using hot rolled coil from India. So basically, the US government investigated whether if you buy HRC from India and make a pipe, that should be subject to the pipe anti-dumping duties against India, and they found that it constitutes circumvention. Another examples is aluminum foil made with Chinese foil stock or sheet. Again, if you use Chinese origin sheet, DOC, the Department of Commerce concluded, then as a result of this circumvention inquiry, then it should be subject to China dumping orders, and it should not be considered Korea or Thailand aluminum. So the reason that this is being more and more often preferred is several. First of all, any single US producer can file a complaint to bring this case. In dumping, there is at least a 25% representation requirement. In other words, 25% of total US producers should support the case. And also, the domestic producers don't have to prove injury or don't even have to say that there is any unfair trade practice going on, such as dumping or subsidy. And that therefore the bar is lower to bring cases of circumvention. And we should also note that with some recent regulatory changes, the OC now, the US government allowed these duties to be applied retroactively as far back as going to November 2021. Previously, it used to be that you could only apply duties retroactively with the start of the case, but now they can go back to 2021. This has not been applied in practice. The requirement is there, and the DOC has not opted to use this, but the option is there, and they can go back as far back as 2021. This is just a chart showing the increased use of circumvention in terms of number of initiation. As you can see, it's being used more and more often. Just to draw some comparison between the origin rules, because it's a little bit different, the types of tests that are being applied. For example, in many countries, according to origin rules, if you bring HRC and produce corrosion-resistant galvanized products, that becomes that gets the origin of the country of manufacture. And even in dumping cases, that's enough to actually make the product originated where it's manufactured. But in circumvention cases, the DOC takes a broader view. For example, when they analyzed galvanized steel production in Vietnam using HRC and cold roll produced in China, they not only looked at the rolling process, the final process, but they looked at the entire chain of steel production, and they said to make this product, you need steel melting, which costs around $6.8 billion. But the rolling, the very final process, you can only do with a $70 million investment. This is not my findings. This is what the DOC findings say. So they covered the whole chain of steel production and found that the corrosion-resistant production is a very minor portion of the production, and that they said they found in the end that this constitutes circumvention and started applying China anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And finally, there was a different attempt last year brought by Steel Dynamics, a steel company in the US. And they targeted this time the input product. For example, if a company uses Japanese HRC, this was also against Vietnam, even though there are no dumping and CVD orders against Japan, uh, Steel Dynamics argued that it should also constitute circumvention. DOC did not agree with Steel Dynamics, but it would have had some very major implications, which means if you buy an input product, semi-finished product anywhere, and if there are dumping and subsidy duties against that product that you use as an input, then it would open up the way for cases to be brought to apply the any dumping and CVD duties on the input product. So DOC for now declined to initiate that inquiry. It's rejected, but as I said, if this goes forward in the future, it will have very major implications. So I think the final slide is also relate to this. Now the U.S. government has tracking is tracking the melt and smelt location of any import coming to the United States. As you may know, there's a SEMA steel import monitor system and aluminum import monitor system. With some recent changes, they require all the importers to not only declare the origin of the product, also where the melt for steel and smelt for aluminum products take place. And the government has already started using this system in terms of the Russia sanctions. As you may remember, the U.S. government says any imports of aluminum articles where any amount of primary aluminum used, Russian primary aluminum used, it should be subject to should not be subject to any Section 232 exclusions, and they're using the tool, the SEMA and aluminum import monitor tool, to track these. So this was the last slide. Thank you very much, and Jessica and I will be happy to answer any questions if you have. Yeah.
So perhaps next step is to track the raw materials.
Yes.
There's a question, Mr. Baysal.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. And I wanted to really add something else to the conversations that and the speeches that you have made. I noticed that the President Trump really started this thing as the national security, and which really started giving exemptions after that to certain countries, naturally Canada and Mexico, and then expanded to Argentina, and then expanded to our Australians that they're nice, and Japan, EU. And I noticed that at the end of the day, from the traditional steel exporters to the US, I would say, except China, which really has so much anti-dumping, it can't sell much, and Russia, which obviously has some restrictions today. Majority of the Islamic countries are exempt. I mean, I'm sorry, they pay the duty. I noticed that all the Middle Eastern countries, which are Islamic, and then I noticed Malaysia, Indonesia, in the Far East, North Africa, mostly, Algeria, Egypt, and then Turkey, and then I noticed that, it just keeps on. So looks like this whole thing changed from the national security to basically a tax for Islamic countries, bringing steel to the United States.
Those, I mean, those are, yes, those are the countries on which products are tariffed. As in plain language, the tariff on Turkish products was an additional 50% for 9 months. Well, I can't put thoughts in President Trump's head. That's what the, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we looked at when we checked the figures last, I think 66%, about 2/3 of US imports by source have some sort of exemption. Now, I mean, in reality, of course, you cannot exceed the quota. But you're right. I also believe that the US government is maybe going selectively on this. But as you know, Russia is subject to these duties. Most Asian countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia. So, but the fact is, major sources, a large portion of US imports have exemptions of some form from these duties. And unfortunately, Turkey and some other countries you mentioned, they don't.
Algeria is also not.
They are subject to
Are they?
232 measures, yes.
232, yes. Okay, any other questions? No, I guess so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.